Welcome to Focus on Health, a series of educational programs highlighting current health issues sponsored by the Department of Nursing at Salisbury University. I'm Dr. Mary DiBartolo, Professor of Nursing at Salisbury University and host of the program. I welcome Samantha Scott. You are a psychologist. You have a private practice in town here called the Child and Family Center, and you are here taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk about a very important topic, anxiety and depression in teens. And I know there's a lot to cover here, but I guess first things first, let's just talk about what is anxiety, what is depression, and then we'll get into some of the related issues, including the role of social media.
Sure. So I think a lot of people know what anxiety and depression is, but I think maybe an important topic is what that looks like in kids. It might look a little bit different in kids and teenagers than it does for adults. So I'll start with anxiety. In the schools, you see a lot of kids who are very nervous to talk to their peers, to raise their hand in class. They're worried what people are thinking about them, if they're going to embarrass themselves, those kind of things. There's lots of social anxieties. I see that very often. And you have some nervous kids and kids that are just kind of anxious in general. And I see a lot of OCD, probably more than people would realize.
What's OCD?
So that would be obsessive compulsive disorder, which a lot of people think is turning lights on and off or checking the stove a number of times, but there's actually a number of different types, and I get a lot of even younger kids with just very, intrusive thoughts of very bad things or bad images or just urges to engage in certain repetitive behaviors throughout the day, and it can be quite challenging.
So is this excessive worrying and anxiety beyond, the normal adolescent, when you're worried about how you're looking or feeling?
Yeah, I think for these kids, and certainly for it to be diagnosable, it has to be interfering in some way. So typically the kids I see, they're so consumed with anxiety that they aren't even being able to pay attention in class. Or they might not go to social events or try out for sports or clubs and things like that. At the very extreme end, I treat a lot of teenagers who don't even make it to school. They get so anxious in the morning, we call it school refusal, but it's debilitating on the extreme end.
Yeah, I think we all go through some of the typical kind of fears in adolescence, but you're saying this is interfering with their ability to attend school and socialize and so forth. And what about depression?
Well, okay, so if you think about depression in little ones, and some people don't, might not even recognize that even younger kids can be depressed, but, it can start as early as 6, 7.
What ages are we talking?
Sure, and it can start as early as 6 or 7, but for the really younger kids, a lot of times they're just very irritable. You see behavior problems and things of that nature, not necessarily just sadness, just difficulty regulating their mood in general. I think usually when I see younger kids with depressive symptoms, there's a pretty high genetic component. It's not as often situationally based as for older kids. And then in the older kids, you can still see more irritability than sadness. So I think that's important for parents to recognize, because you don't want to just assume, my kid is still going to sports and school and I don't see them crying, they're probably okay. But I think irritability is a good marker for kids and teenagers in terms of depression. But then you certainly have a subset of kids who start withdrawing from things or avoiding social events and activities and things like that too.
Well, isn't this something else too, the moodiness associated with just being a teenager, and how do you decide when you're crossing that line?
And that's so tough because, I get a lot of parents who find out way down the line that their kid has been experiencing depression for a long time. And a very common thing that I hear is, I just thought they were being a teenager. They're moody, they are snappy with me, they talk back. I thought that was normal. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it's not.
And wanting to go out and be in their room and isolate themselves.
Right, isolating. And, I'm sure we'll get to it at some point, but, the social media craze and technology, it's more common for kids now to just be in their room doing those things versus when we didn't have that, we went outside and played, and or we were downstairs doing things with our family.
Where the one TV was.
Right. So I think it's important for parents not to just assume that that's typical teenage behavior.
So again, just maybe recap before we get into some of the reasons why we're seeing a spike in this.
Right.
The symptoms you're saying are more about irritability and
Sure.
moodiness and...
So for anxiety, I would say probably for either, avoiding certain activities could happen for either reason. They're either very scared to do certain things or they're starting to lose motivation to engage in activities. For both, you can also see somatic symptoms like stomach aches or headaches or different avoidance kind of symptoms. Kids who are sick a lot or going to the nurse a lot.
They can be related,
a red
right?
flag. It can be.
Anxiety often
Right.
will lead to a depression.
Yeah, and I do see anxiety and depression are often co-occur. It depends on the kid which comes first, I guess. But certainly the somatic symptoms could be related to anxiety or depression and signal either one.
And how prevalent is depression these days and anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, I think the latest research shows that as high as 1 in 4 kids will have a diagnosable anxiety disorder by the time they reach 18, and I think depression is as high as 1 in 5. So it is certainly on the rise, and I would probably even estimate that those are underestimates.
Right.
Those are the ones that we know are getting treatment or being identified in some way. And like I said, a lot of times once kids come to my office, they usually disclose that they've been feeling bad for a really long time and no one knew.
So we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but what's the typical treatment then for each of these?
So the most common type of therapeutic treatment we call CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. So we target the way that they think about things, making sure that they're not perpetuating how they feel. So if you're anxious or depressed, it's very common to anticipate the worst or to only focus on things that aren't going well, and you can kind of get in this negative cycle of negative thinking. So we target the way that kids are thinking and perceiving their environment. Some of it's behavioral, so if a kid is very anxious to do things, you have to make them do some stuff, but giving them the tools to be able to do it and feel confident and, building small steps at a time versus, very big situations that might be anxiety provoking. And same with depression, the more you do, the better you feel typically. If you can get to that party and be around friends, you usually feel better in that moment. So helping kids not avoid and withdraw and isolate is all part of it.
And there's such pressure now on how you look too. I guess the body image thing is huge.
Sure. And that's always been, I think it's probably exemplified because everything is online, so you're just constantly bombarded with images of other people and celebrities and even your friends taking pictures of themselves.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I know that's one of the big things we wanted to get to today is the impact. Well, we also said just so much exposure all the time with news, 24/7, online, on TV, and how that can be anxiety producing. And then I know you also wanted to talk about social media.
So, I don't think it's a secret that anxiety and depression are on the rise. I think a lot of adults recognize that kids are under a lot of pressure and it's different now than it used to be. We talk about it all the time. But I don't think adults necessarily realize the psychological impact that social media is having on children. And we were thrown into it quickly. No one studied social media before it happened. No one knew what having access to information 24 hours a day was going to do for anyone. And so now people are doing the research, but is it going to change? Probably not. I mean, this is our new world, is technology. So, I think there's a number of reasons why social media is good, but in terms of anxiety and depression, the research is starting to show direct links with amount of time online with depression and suicide. Now, it's correlational. It could be that you have more depressed and suicidal kids who are now isolating and online more. It could go either way. But research is also showing that when you get kids offline, their ability to be empathic and communicate gets better, which makes sense,
Well, we all worry about the whole cell phone thing.
Sure.
Kids are texting instead of learning how to have therapeutic communication skills,
Right.
Actually talking to people.
Yes, and they don't know how to do it. So here's some of the differences. When my generation went to school, you could have some bullying, you could have anxiety, depression, things in school, but you left at 3. and you got a break until the next day. You hopefully were surrounded by supportive family. Maybe you had clubs or sports that you went to, people outside of school that you could connect with. Now our kids leave and they're just like this, you know, and as soon as the bell rings, and actually probably all throughout school, because now they have phones in school, they're online. I mean, literally almost 24 hours a day. I have kids that tell me they're up till 2, 3 a.m., you know, keeping their streaks alive on Snapchat, or, you know, just watching YouTube videos. And then they keep their phones next to them. So even if they go to sleep at 3, it is beeping all night long. So, you know, the impact on sleep alone, I think, is huge.
Well, I had heard about a research study about the anxiety of just hearing that you got a text message and the pressure to answer it versus keeping your phone like off, where you don't know every time you're getting a message.
Oh, it's completely different.
Very
And I'm no different. I understand what that feels like. And there's certainly research out there that shows the same centers in the brain are activated as if you were using cocaine. I mean, there's pleasure centers in our brain. It's addictive.
Well, as if we don't have enough addictions to worry about. Now we have this new avenue. And I know we talked earlier that, you know, kids aren't even on Facebook anymore. They're on other avenues like Instagram, Snapchat. And you said there's some other sites that are really problematic.
Well, you know, a lot of my kids, and you know, once they come to me, they already have anxiety and depression and other issues. But I hear about a lot of different kinds of sites. And there are sites, I think a lot of our kids seek information about anxiety and depression, but there's a lot of hurtful, harmful sites out there too. I didn't talk about one of the symptoms of depression that's common now that wasn't in the past, but that's self-harm or self-injury and cutting. It's super common. And I have kids all the time tell me they learned how to do that online. And they were just Googling depression to see if they had it or what was wrong with them, and that's what popped up. And so that's how they learned about cutting. And now, you know, they're engrossed in this negative pattern. It's depressing, I know.
But I think it's important that we get it out there, talk about it. And I know one of the things we want to achieve is to give parents some tips on, you know, obviously we talked about the symptoms, and then what is a parent to do if they suspect such a thing?
Well, certainly, you know, in terms of social media, I do these talks all the time. You're not going to get your child off social media. It is their world. It is their life. It's how they communicate. It's very difficult for a teenager to not check some of those sites and then go into school the next day. They call it social suicide. I mean, literally, because then you're out of the loop the next day, and that interferes with, you know, your social relationships once you're back in school.
And that's anxiety producing, I imagine.
It is. This is their world. It's 24 hours a day.
So that's unrealistic. So what can you do, though, to maybe set some limits somehow?
There definitely needs to be limits set. There's apps all over the place, depending on what kind of phone you have, what kind of family plan you have. Apps so that you can limit the amount of time they're on there, apps so you can limit which sites they go to. And if there are kids watching, I'm sorry, but I think parents should be monitoring what's being said. You should have access to whatever accounts your child has. Because unfortunately, your child may be very well intentioned, but there are a lot of bad people on the other side of whatever app they're on. And one of the big problems with social media in teens is social media and the internet is very abstract. And kids don't have abstract thinking. You know, it's just developing as you enter being a teenager. And so understanding that the person on the other side of the screen isn't who they say they are, or they are stalking you in some way, or things like that, I don't think kids understand.
Well, just not having a well-established self-esteem, you know, to withstand insults or bullying, or you know, even the mildest of insults can be traumatic, I think, at that age.
Oh, sure. Well, and that, you know, that's kind of a different issue, but I think if parents are able to monitor what their child is doing, you know, it kind of leads into bullying. I have a lot of kids that are bullied but do the same thing because they don't know that what they're doing is bullying. You know, you're behind a screen, maybe you're making jokes, or you and your friends go to the beach one day and don't invite another one of your friend, and then you post all these pictures. I mean, it's exclusion. It's a very raw type of bullying and probably more hurtful than what we used to be accustomed to when we grew up, if someone took your lunch money or something. But feeling left out or feeling like people don't like you or value you is very hurtful. So you're asking what to tell parents. Just as much as you want to monitor what other people are saying and doing to your child, we need to be teaching our children how to be empathic and aware of what they're doing online and how that impacts other kids.
So taking a look at your own child and having those frank discussions about what's appropriate, what isn't.
Right. Because just like I said earlier, there was no manual as we got thrown into this technological world. And so now we're knowing that kids aren't handling it responsibly, and they're doing a lot of really hurtful things to one another online. So I think we as adults have to start educating our kids about how to use technology responsibly. It's a different kind of kindness lesson that isn't going to happen in schools.
Well, you're right. We're in a very reactive world right now. Now we're starting to see all these issues and saying, well, what can we do to backtrack?
Right.
It's kind of like the cat's out of the bag now.
It is. It is. It's a little scary.
Oh. So having some discussions about social media and monitoring that more closely, whether your kids like it or not. Of course, they're going to say, I don't want you involved, but we have to do what's best for our kids. And then second, what if a parent is really concerned about severe depression or suicide, and what recourse or resources would they have?
Sure. So some of the big red flags for depression and maybe even suicide, certainly as we talked about, if your kid is more withdrawn or isolating, like I said, don't just necessarily assume that's typical teenage behavior. Any kind of change in behavior, I think, is important to keep an eye on. If you think that they are engaging in any kind of drug use or drinking, certainly I think pot is pretty common, especially in high school, in our high schools. And there's this new kind of mentality that it's legal now, so it's okay to do. So you've got that battle, but even drinking, and now kind of the pill epidemic, and there's fairly easy access to certain kind of opioids and things like that. So those are red flags. Not wanting to do certain activities and things like that. So I think if parents are concerned, you have to talk to your child, and not just when you think things are really bad, right? Yeah. And it kind of comes down to another recommendation in terms of social media and parenting. Just because your kid wants to be online all night long doesn't mean that they just get to do that. And especially while they're living at home, I think it's important for parents to try to help their kids find a better balance. So there has to be
the courage to take the phone away?
Take it away, but sit down at the dinner table and have a family meal. That doesn't happen like it used to.
No.
Parents, you have to put your phones down too.
Be good role models.
Right. Or get out of the house, or have a family movie night or game night, or take your kid to a local museum, whatever it might be. I know, and kids might be resistant, but I would say 9 times out of 10, once they're off their phone and engaged in something else, they are okay. So I think parents have to help their kids find that balance, which should also lend itself to just more frequent check-ins in general. And just open, I think, non-judgmental conversations. Like I said, you're not going to go in and say, like, oh, that Snapchat is so stupid, I don't know why you're on there, because it's important to them.
Right.
So validation when you're talking to your kids usually means you're not saying, I know, but. Just saying, okay, tell me about your world. What are you experiencing? What are your friends experiencing? How are you doing? And then just listening.
And then, of course, there are resources that parents can, call if they should suspect something serious is going on, or take them to see a counselor, make an appointment.
Sure. There's tons. We actually have tons of great resources here in Wycomico County. There's counselors of all shapes and sizes, and different insurance companies and things like that. You can always talk to your child's school. Every school around here has some sort of counselor or social worker or psychologist. But there is no harm in taking your child to get evaluated or to be checked on. Yeah. And I think our pediatricians do a pretty good job of that around here too. So if you have concerns, you know, ask a professional to check in, and there's always screeners that your child can fill out. In my experience, and this is probably one of the pros of technology, kids are a little bit more insightful than maybe they once were. Depression and anxiety isn't quite as taboo as it once was. Kids know what the symptoms are. They talk about it openly with one another. So I guess that's probably a positive in some regard. You know, if you bring it up to your child, they're going to know what you're talking about.
Right. From a parent angle, always better safe than sorry.
I agree.
So.
I agree.
Well, thank you so much for being on the program. It's a lot of information. I know we could talk a lot more, but I think for now, you know, I think we're making parents aware of the symptoms and that the role of social media and the importance of talking to your child and setting some limits in that regard, especially if you're suspicious of something's going on. So, any final take-home point you'd like to really emphasize for our viewers?
Well, I think probably to wrap it up, I think the take-home point is the world is a much more scary, fast-paced, developed world than it used to be, and I think parents need to recognize that that's just as true for their teenager as it is for us as adults, and maybe more so because they aren't as equipped to process all of the information that they are bombarded with all day long. And so to appreciate that and to check in with their kids and help them find a balance and protect them from as much of the negative side of technology as they can.
Well, thank you so much. That sounds like great advice. And again, I appreciate you taking time to come on the program.
Thank you. This is great.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Focus on Health here on PAC 14.